I'm Greg Brown. I'm Executive Director for the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise, and I'm so pleased to welcome you all here today. I'm thrilled to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Mary Moore Hamrick. Mary Moore Hamrick serves not only as a Senior Fellow with the Kenan Institute, but also as CEO of Political Quotient Advisors. She also previously served as Chief Public Policy Officer for Grant Thornton and has spent over 30 years working on Capitol Hill. Mary Moore is particularly well equipped to handle the partisan divide. She holds her JD and MBA from UNC and her undergraduate degree from Duke. So today we're going to be discussing Biden's first 100 days and really what are the policy implications with a particular eye toward the impact on business. And we're going to do this very much from a nonpartisan perspective, just straight facts right down the middle. And then towards the end of the session, we will spend a few minutes fielding your questions, but you're welcome to submit questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So Mary Moore, let's start even before day one of the administration here. Let's talk about the campaign promises on the trail. What did President Biden promise to do? He said, build back better. But kind of from a more complete perspective, what were those things exactly? How did they inform the specific first 100 days and the policy things that have already gone into place?
Well, Greg, thank you. It's truly a pleasure to be here today. And I think Biden, like most elected officials, has held very closely. He's really held closely to his campaign promises of getting COVID under control, as you said, building back better, achieving racial justice, and being the healer in chief, if you will, of America. I think it's important for business to focus on these four topics because when you look at Biden's actions to date and his plans going forward, he really takes a holistic approach and weaves all of these campaign promises into every bill, executive order, or piece of legislation. So I think you'll see that throughout our conversation as we go forward.
Yeah, great. And it's been exactly 3 months to the day now since Biden took office. We've seen confirmation hearings, signing of the COVID pandemic relief bill, that is the American Rescue Plan into law. That's been over a month now. So, what are the key things that we should be aware of as we're looking back on just the year-to-date accomplishments, and then how does that inform what we're looking forward to, and especially again what businesses should be looking forward to?
Well, it's not surprising that since Biden has the longest years of serving in the Congress, that he is in serving as vice president, that he has really gone into an active phase right from the get-go, focused not only on his 100 days, but the 2-year window because of the tight margins in the Senate before the 2022 elections. I was recently listening to Mara Liaison at our Public Affairs Board meeting, and this NPR correspondent shared that she thought that she said she had never covered a president with as big agenda as Biden with as narrow a margin in Congress. She said that earlier this month. And when you look at the timeline, I'll point out 3 key dates after the 100 days. You've got August 1st, when the debt limit comes back into play. Then you go to September 6th, when the pandemic unemployment insurance expires. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, Greg, because some are interested in from a business perspective, is that keeping employees out of the workforce? And finally, as always, the government funding runs out at the end of September, and Congress often gets backed up right to that deadline. So those are the key ones I'd point out for business right now, Greg.
Yeah. Great. So you already mentioned, Democrats have control of the White House and the House and the Senate. We know that it's just a razor thin margin that the administration is able to govern with in Congress. So tell us a little bit more about the 117th Congress, how that's impacted the first 100 days, but then also what some of the tensions are as we look forward to current proposed legislation.
Well, it really is. In my 30 years of serving in Congress, we can go back to the 2000, 2001, when we last had a 50-50 tie in the Senate. You can see that if party lines votes break along party lines, Vice President Kamala Harris is going to have to break that tie. And then over on the House side, right now, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, who is very adept at bringing together her progressives and the more moderate wing of her caucus, but it's getting more and more difficult. She can only lose 3 votes to get to that 215 margin that she needs. So she has to hold everybody. And you've got to think about, we're in a pandemic. First of all, you got to get everybody to agree, and then you can't have anybody sick. So it is really, really tight, really, really tight.
Yeah, but with that said, I think there's a feeling that you have kind of more independent or idiosyncratic voices in the House, but still there's been probably more focus on the Senate. Is that because it's more divided, or is that because that's where there's more deliberate policy being made or influential decisions being made? I mean, what's up with the Senate?
Well, the Senate really comes down to their rules. And it's long been said in Washington that the Senate is the saucer which cools the hot tea that comes over from the House. And that's because when you look at this chart, you can see that under regular order and under the everyday Senate rules, you need 60 votes to proceed. So if we know that there are 50 Democrats in the Senate, you're going to need 10 Republicans to move a bill forward. Now, there's one exception to that, and that process is for presidential nominees, which we're going through now, and we'll talk a little bit about, and the budget reconciliation. So typically each year you have an annual budget, and you do have a process that it would only take 51 votes. And we saw that come into play with the pandemic and the back to work relief bill that passed recently. So that's why you truly are focusing on the Senate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So let's spend some time now digging into specific policy issues and what's already happened in the first 100 days, and then also kind of where these kind of issues are going to lead us for the rest of this year. We kind of put these into 4 main categories: cabinet nominees, executive orders, legislation, and trade initiatives. So let's start with the cabinet nominees. Tell us a little bit about the important cabinet nominees from the perspective of the business sector.
Well, I think most people aren't aware that when President Biden comes into office, he's got not only his cabinet, but he's got 1,200 nominations that have to be Senate confirmed. And in Washington, we like to say that personnel is policy. So that's why people are truly watching who's placed into the cabinet. You've got a very experienced cabinet. Think of Obama 2.0. Vice President Biden saw what it was like to work with the cabinet. President Biden comes in, he wants to have a more diversified group. And so I think it's kind of important to look at the cabinet from a business perspective in 2 buckets. And I think we saw the economy and jobs bucket, where you've got Secretary of State, you've got Janet Yellen, certainly experienced coming in as Treasury Secretary. And I think the other important thing to think about is we look at the cabinet and we look at how those individuals are leading their agencies and working together. They have to put their team in place and get their team on the field. So not only do we have to get those nominations done, think about those. There are 790 positions that the Washington Post is tracking that they say are key. And right now, 52% of those positions don't even have a nominee yet. Now, we have about 4% of those positions have been Senate confirmed, 33 positions have been confirmed, and about 17% are waiting to be teed up to be confirmed. So getting this cabinet in place takes quite a while. It's very important. But the one trend I want to point out is that there have been much more bipartisan confirmations under President Biden than we have seen in previous administrations. To just compare this administration with the last administration, 80% of Biden's cabinet were confirmed with 60 votes or higher, so on a bipartisan basis, and that compares. 80% had a very bipartisan basis confirmed. Only 20% were in that tight 50 to 59 vote margin, compared to Donald Trump, who had 40% of his cabinet in that tight 50 to 59 vote confirmation range, and more like 60% instead of Biden's 80%. So the good news is we're reaching more bipartisan belief on your confirmation, and you've got some people that are like Janet Yellen, who were confirmed 84 with 84 votes. Anthony Blinken coming in at state with 78, and then when we talk a little bit on our next slide, you'll see some even more overwhelming confirmations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So let's kind of pivot towards some of the other nominees that sort of specifically related to important issues facing business right now. So kind of trade, national defense, climate issues, and tell us a bit about these folks.
Well, it's very interesting. We've seen John Kerry, former Secretary of State under the Obama administration. He is a new appointee in a new position in President Biden's cabinet as a climate envoy, and he is certainly well trained for this. Was recently in China. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Very experienced, and you're going to see that climate is going to play a major role. Where I link these three together. Because foreign affairs and trade, when we talk about that a little bit later, that's the holistic view that we've shifted to and that business needs to know and look at. USTR and trade is very important. I'm pleased to say that former Ways and Means staffer Catherine Tay was confirmed 98-0. Which bodes very well. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was confirmed 93-2. So I think we're moving forward. We're getting that team in place, but that's what we need in order to have these agencies up and running and fully functioning.
Yeah. So before we turn to executive orders, I just want to do a couple just kind of quick follow-ups on there. So you mentioned it's a huge task to get all these folks in place, but that's true for every administration. Is there a sense of whether the Biden administration is ahead or behind of a typical administration in terms of getting folks nominated and confirmed?
That's an excellent question, Greg. And I was looking at that this morning. Biden is really pretty much on track. He is exactly where George W. Bush was at this point in time. He's a little bit ahead of Donald Trump. He's got 33 Senate confirmed positions. Biden has. Trump was at about 25 at this point in time, and he's a little bit behind Obama. President Obama was had over 60 conferees at this point in time. But I would just say he's on track, and I think that because of the relationship that he has with Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, understands that we need to get the team on the field. So I think that they'll just proceed and get this done as quickly as possible.
So one other kind of quick follow-up here. I don't want to venture too far into sort of the partisan issues, but I mean, certainly there's been a tension in the Democratic Party between progressives and moderates. And that you can sort of satisfy different constituents in different ways through nominations. And I mean, do you feel like the nominations and the confirmations of folks that are most important to the business sector have kind of broken more towards moderate or more towards progressive? And I mean, you said bipartisan, votes. But is that reflective of sort of the ones that are most important for the business sector, you think?
I think the ones most important for the business sector really The good news is they're very experienced. You've got Janet Yellen coming in at Treasury. You've got Jay Powell, who remains at the Fed, not an appointee, but a key player, and he's been in place. Anthony Blinken served in the Obama administration at State, and State's going to be very, very important to trade. And I think from a business perspective, USTR, our U.S. trade representative hails from Asia. It speaks Mandarin, and I think Catherine will be a great USTR representative. So I think on balance, business should be comfortable with the cabinet heads. I think it's the legislation and the executive orders that they need to watch more. So that's where I would keep my focus.
All right. Well, that's a good segue into our next topic, which is executive orders. So, President Obama famously, or maybe infamously, depending on your perspective, referred to executive orders, obliquely saying, "I have a pad of paper and a pen." So we certainly saw a lot of executive orders with the Trump administration as well. So what has Biden done with his pad of paper and pen, and how have executive orders impacted the business sector in particular?
Well, I think President Biden is writing a little bit faster than President Obama. I'll say that. He's got a little bit deeper pad and a little bit faster pen, and that's probably because of his experience coming in as vice president. While business, when I speak to the C-suite leaders and CEOs, I advise them to really stay on top of those executive orders and see where they are. There's three that I'd really like to point out for our listeners today that I think that are sort of most impactful. The first one, I think many in the energy field are familiar with. President Biden put a pause on any new oil and natural gas leasing on public lands and offshore waters. And in that executive order, he canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, which certainly showed an area where he favored his environmental supporters over his labor supporters. And there was the reversal of many actions that Trump had made on the environment. So that was the first one. The second one that I think that all businesses should be mindful of and look at the outcome on, which I think is important, particularly coming out of a pandemic, and as we have an awareness of the fragility of supply chains. President Biden asked for a 100-day review of all the U.S. pharmaceutical, mineral, and battery supply chains, and ask agencies to identify ways to secure and invest in those supply chains. There were also a review of 6 key sectors: defense, public health, biological preparedness, IT, energy, transportation, and finally, agriculture and food preparation. So, I would say in the months ahead, we should see what are agencies putting out about those supply chains and what actions are taken either by those agencies or where is Congress encouraged to act to facilitate domestic supply chains here at home. The third executive order, and the final one I'll touch on today, is it's sort of in the Buy American column, not dissimilar from our last administration, but being very familiar with the federal procurement process. I think you're going to see some changes in the agencies on the federal purchases more towards domestic goods. So those are the 3 key executive orders I would point out for business.
Yeah, and in many ways, these sort of interact with each other too in ways that are important and maybe well informed by what we've learned from the pandemic. These are lessons that I think companies are rethinking some of these issues, but so are businesses in terms of long, fragile supply chains, dependence and foreign issues, and how the economy can be more resilient to shocks, both the broad macro economy as well as individual businesses. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. I want to keep moving along here. Clearly legislative priorities. There's a whole slate of legislative priorities Ones that are probably first order important to business include issues around pandemic, back to work, that's immediately facing us now. A little bit longer term infrastructure, climate, tax policy, those have been deliberately pulled together into a single issue. Of course, foreign affairs and foreign trade, lots going on there. And immigration is not just a social issue, but one that's very important to many businesses as well. So can you give us a kind of walk us through some of those?
Well, let's start with the back to work and the Pandemic Relief Act. That particular bill was a $1.9 trillion bill, which is huge when you consider President Obama's bailout bill. We thought that was large at $180 billion. It was President Biden's first economic stimulus bill, if you will, largest bill ever enacted, one of the largest ever in congressional history. And this is the sixth bill on pandemic relief on top of the $4 trillion that's already been spent. It was a very politically charged environment between the two parties because President Biden decided to do it on the budget reconciliation process with only 51 votes. It contains various buckets of spending, some pandemic related, some not. Certainly, there was the pandemic direct spending that went to vaccines and distribution. Second of all, there was government assistance for income supplements for some of the hardest hit groups, including unemployment benefits, an additional $300 a week supplement that will go through September 6th. This is of interest to employees. There are economists who differ on how that will impact employees going back to work, given the increase. There's actually an increase in after-tax income by over 20% for the lowest 20% of U.S. income earners. So there's been some back and forth on that, diffuse support of the $1,400 checks that went out to those making $75,000 or a married couple receiving $2,800 in checks, making up to $150,000. Government also is paying for healthcare premiums for those with incomes between 100 and 400% of the federal poverty line. And then there was some non-pandemic related relief of about $30 billion in transit and infrastructure reforms, a multi-employer pension bailout, and then just some expanded welfare support in terms of child tax credits, earned income tax credits, expanded food stamps programs, et cetera. So those are some of the knowns. We'll see how this rolls out. The unknowns will include is this enough to keep those hardest hit taken care of, and how do we balance that? And we still won't know how all those dollars are going to be distributed and spent. We know the rollout of the dollar amount, but we don't really know what the ultimate cost will be. So that is, I think we're just going to have to observe and see how this plays out over time, Greg. It was a big effort.
Yeah, no, it was huge, and I think from an economics perspective, people are still trying to understand what the macro impact is going to be, the timing, as well as the magnitude of the impact. Just because there is a lot of uncertainty about how the economy is going to recover, and how many of the people who have left the labor force are going to come back. What are their incentives? Is this being driven by kind of personal considerations or financial considerations, or concern about their health? So there's just a lot of uncertainty about what the overall economic impact is going to be of that. But then we've got another one on the horizon here, right? There's another giant spending plan that's being teed up. Under infrastructure, though, I think, as the previous, bill, as you already discussed, really was wide ranging, more than just infrastructure. There's climate stuff in there, there's tax stuff in there, as well as some other things. So walk us through kind of what's in there now and what you think is likely to actually come out the other end.
Well, you're absolutely right, Greg. We need to look at this through a holistic lens of climate, energy, and infrastructure. You know, how is this? And Biden's plan, and it's about an 80-page plan that I read through. It's called the American Jobs Plan. Really funds 4 buckets of projects over 8 years. It's got over $1 trillion price tag that this 8 years of 4 buckets of projects are offset or paid for by 15 years worth of corporate tax increases. So if we look at the American Jobs Plan and we look at the 4 investment categories or the infrastructure spending, the first category is your typical transportation, think roads, bridges, rails, seaports, dams, airports, your typical basic infrastructure bucket. The second bucket is described as a how we live at home bucket, which deals with, think about clean water, providing universal access to broadband, strengthening our power infrastructure or electrical grid, coming off of the recent situation in Texas, and then building and retrofitting, whether it's affordable housing, schools, community colleges, and childcare facilities. Think federal buildings like veterans hospitals and the VA system. So that's sort of the second bucket. The third bucket is a healthcare infrastructure bucket that really expands Medicaid long-term care and would seek to increase the number of family care health providers in that field and tilt the healthcare playing field in favor of employees who would be more easily able to organize into unions and collectively bargain with their employers. So that's that third bucket of healthcare infrastructure, followed by a fourth bucket, which I would describe as a research and development bucket. China is number 2 in the world in their R&D spending, and this is President Biden's effort to provide incentives for domestic production, workforce training. It includes $50 billion for semiconductor manufacturing and research so that we can get up to speed in the chips area, and $400 billion for clean energy R&D. So those are the 4 buckets. We contrast that with the Made in America tax plan that reforms the corporate tax system. And there are 3 key business taxes that I would point out, Greg, that are most important. Number 1, Biden proposes to increase the corporate rate from 21 to 28%. Secondly, he would have a 15% global minimum corporate rate on book income, which is a new way of looking at income to capture those companies who were paying very little in tax. And the third tax increase is an international move to double the minimum tax on foreign income to 21%. And so those 3 key corporate increases are accompanied by a number of tax incentives for clean energy and disincentives for fossil fuels. So let me just pause there.
Yeah. So a little bit of follow up on that. I think there's a question among economists, but maybe also questions from a political perspective about the change in corporate tax rate and what impact that's going to have. I think economists are concerned that the U.S. has moved from what was a not very competitive global tax position to one that is sort of in line with other OECD countries. Not the most competitive, but much better than it was before. And a concern that raising corporate tax rates back up could be counterproductive, and especially when you think about what the impact could be on things like domestic production. So to the extent that companies are able to locate operations, undertake real economic activity, having a high corporate tax rate can clearly be a disincentive for that. And so and then I think also some of the there's been at least one Democratic senator that's come out opposing the full proposed increase. So what is kind of current thinking around tax provisions for the corporate tax and how viable different levels are?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. And certainly, as you mentioned, Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, has said that he's comfortable with a 25% rate, but not 28%. And then there were conversations this week. The one thing that President Biden has not included in an infrastructure bill, which many in Congress have actually looked at, is a vehicle miles driven tax. And I say that as opposed to increasing the gas tax, because as we move more and more of our cars and trucks to electric vehicles, you really have to, if you're going to say who's using the roads and bridges, you really have to look at it in a different structure. So how could we construct a vehicle miles driven tax? And that would offset some of those corporate taxes for the spend. Senator Cornyn, Republican from Texas, has said he's comfortable with an $800 billion level. And basically, this is all part of the sausage making, is depending on what level of spend that the president and the Congress come to an agreement on, that will determine the level, that will impact directly the level of corporate taxes that are needed. So you're absolutely right, Greg. It's an ongoing conversation and something that I think will play out over time.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting to me, because I think, economists generally like to have taxes that are closely tied to the economic activity that's occurring. So in the sense that we want to fund an infrastructure bill with things that are directly funding, taxes that are directly related to infrastructure, I think that's something that economists tend to like. In some ways, you're sort of internalizing the public good that government is providing in a way that is more economically efficient. So it's interesting to hear about that. I wasn't aware of that previously. Okay, so we got to keep moving, unfortunately. But another big issue, of course, foreign affairs, and in particular for the business sector, trade. We know, as former chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Biden comes into office with a lot of experience in this area, but a lot of, I don't know what the right word is, frayed foreign relationships, and some that are maybe becoming outright hostile or have become that. So, there's a lot to do there, let's say. So, kind of what stayed the same, what's going to be changing, what's the negotiating position for the new administration with some of the more important relationships, such as China. I'm kind of curious what your take is on this.
Well, I think what stayed the same is, and we're really building on it, is an increased awareness of how closely our economic security is becoming more and more tied with our national security. And so that you really have to look at the combination of trade from a point of view of foreign affairs, and think the recent requirements to get licenses to do business with Huawei, that sort of thing. President Biden is really focusing on putting his team in place, getting a deep collaborative bench to bridge between economic and national security. So I think the two individuals that business should be focused on certainly are Secretary of State Andrew Blinken, and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. We've certainly seen them traveling together. I think that these are going to really influence this way of thinking. What's happened in response to the China Belt and Roads initiatives is we've got both liberals and conservatives coming up with a bipartisan new way of thinking. We need to get our house in order to build the U.S. up. And President Biden is trying to increase our industrial base and our manufacturing, as we discussed earlier, through our supply chains, our research and development. How do we protect our infrastructure from attack? Think about the recent SolarWinds Russia cybersecurity hacking incident, and emerging technology. 5G is going to become very critical. We've got artificial intelligence, biotech, and data analytics. So one of Biden's first executive orders, deals around this reshoring. How do we provide whatever executive orders, tax incentives, et cetera, to move things here. Second of all, in the foreign space, you mentioned some of the changes and more disruptions to our foreign allies. This is where from day one you saw President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken seeking to rebuild alliances and relationships with our allies. On the one hand, they've made lots of calls in their first 90 days, listening to our allies and trying to see where they are on trade. But on the other hand, and speaking with Myron Brilliant over at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who heads up their international trade, he says we can expect that President Biden is going to go slow on renegotiating trade deals, with the exception of a couple of areas. And that would be over in Europe, the situation with the Airbus and Boeing, and certainly re-entering the WTO and re-entering the Paris Climate Accord. Those are areas where we will re-engage in multilateral trade deals. We've certainly seen our activity in something nicknamed, we now have the Quad. Last Congress, we heard about the Squad. Well, now we have the Quad, which is US, Japan, India, and Australia, all looking at the world from the perspective of what are the needs of those countries vis-a-vis China. The third, Greg, is certainly how does the United States present a united front on dealing with our competitors, which I would say in rank order would be China, Russia, Iran, and South Korea, where we may have some concerns. And let me just focus today on China, because President Biden has said that China is our greatest military, technological, and economic challenger. Businesses are certainly aware of the supply chain situation, the threat to our technological edge, that government subsidies by China often favor their industries over ours, that certainly undermine our national interest. I was most interested in a Wall Street Journal article earlier this month saying that China's point of view now is that Beijing sees that China is equal to the US. And that sort of came out in the Anchorage meeting back in March, where we saw our Secretary of State criticizing China on human rights and the threats against Taiwan. But China's foreign policy expert, Mr. Yang, became a national hero for lecturing the United States on our deep-seated human rights problems that certainly have disrupted in our racial justice area, and said that China would not follow a rules-based order. So that's our negative confrontation. But on the positive side, certainly this week, we have seen a working relationship between climate envoy John Kerry being the first to go to China to meet with China and come out with a very positive pronouncement prior to President Biden's April summit this week on climate. So I think that's what business really needs to look after and be aware that these are the areas that everything is going to be focused on, and how do we become competitive and secure our national economy.
Yeah, I think these are really interesting questions to think about. How global alliances reform or are impacted by current policy issues, because the U.S. is the largest economy in the world and super important to China, but we're that much more important if we're well aligned, with other major economies. And so this notion around the Quad, I think, is quite an important one, because I think, to the extent that we're able to find those commonalities with trade policies with other countries, that's going to make the U.S. much more effective in terms of dealing with some of these issues that are of utmost concern in terms of longer term trade imbalances and technology IP issues and all of that, right? It's the China can ignore the US with some peril, but it can't ignore the entire global community. It's still the most important part of its economy. Okay, so we could go on there for sure, but let's turn to immigration now, right? So immigration's such a hot button topic. politically, but I think that, sort of many of the social reactions to immigration policy are different than sort of the business sector reactions. And so, help us understand better kind of what the first and foremost immigration issues are for business in the U.S.
Well, I think it's interesting that sometimes taking no action can be the most impactful. And we actually saw this on March 31st when the Biden administration allowed the Trump administration's COVID-19 imposed ban from last June to expire on H-1B and other work-related visas. So the key is that that will open up the spigots again on the H-1B and work-related visas, because certainly this will benefit a range of companies from technology to landscaping, where we don't have enough American workers to fill specific needs, especially as our businesses open up and the economy improves. I know that most of the many tech companies left jobs unfilled or just set up relationships to work remotely. So this certainly has been a challenging problem. And I know, Greg, that you may have some additional comments on what the need is in this particular area. But I think that's the main thing on immigration that business needs to be aware of.
Yeah, no, it's issues. And the folks we talk to, especially in the tech industry and such, are really concerned about constraints in terms of being able to expand operations with some of the talent shortages that we see in very highly specialized areas. So thinking about that from a policy perspective is going to be an ongoing issue for the U.S. for the foreseeable future. Okay, so let's talk about money now a little bit for a few minutes before we open it up for Q&A. I'm not sure what the right analogy is, but definitely been on a spending spree. So, and it's not a partisan statement, because I think both Republicans and Democrats have been on a spending spree. Probably a good thing, in the sense that we are trying to keep the economy from ending up in a downward spiral, a self-reinforcing, negative equilibrium. But still, it is a lot of money. We were talking huge deficits. Economists are divided on this in terms of, what the implications are for the U.S. longer term. We're reaching sort of these levels of the federal debt that people worry about in terms of empirically seeing what's happened in other countries when you get to levels around 100% of GDP. So kind of walk us through what the thinking is right now in terms of, the kind of current and projected budget deficits, how this may relate to unemployment going forward, how it relates to, kind of other specific pocketbook issues that the populace is concerned with, as well as businesses.
Well, Greg, you're absolutely right. We have been on a spending spree for 10 years now. We've been kicking the can down the road and just suspending that debt ceiling limit and just saying we're not going to worry about it, going back 10 years through Republican and Democratic administrations. So we're up to at least $22 trillion in federal debt that is the combination of each year of budget deficits just adding up over time. At the conclusion of the 2020 fiscal year, the federal debt was 100% of GDP, and it's projected to rise by an additional 2% of GDP in 2021. So you can see that total federal spending right now is $5.7 trillion. And what I've been watching is this pie chart on the right. I think very few people realize that our mandatory spending, think Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, and interest on the debt, because no matter what happens, those have to be paid. Mandatory spending is crowding out discretionary spending, which is now only 29% of our spend. Think defense, education, research, infrastructure. anything that isn't Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid that the federal government spends is in that discretionary spending bucket. So, that's where we are on that. Maybe we should take a look at the deficit. I know that's going to be an interesting one to look at.
Yeah, for sure. So we have a slide on the deficit spending here. So these are projections, CBO projections, I believe, right?
Yeah, and you talked about the spending spree. You can see that in even before the pandemic spent under President Trump, we were spending at a rate of $1 trillion more than what we were taking in taxes. And then last year with the pandemic, we spent over $3 trillion more than we brought in revenue. And then certainly this year, we're on a similar trajectory, and we haven't even looked at the $2 trillion that's we're looking at for infrastructure needs. So, we're spending like a drunken sailor, but nobody seems to be, much concerned about it. But that's where we are on government spending. I'm sure the economist Greg will have a lot to say on that as we move forward.
Yeah, and maybe we just touch on the kind of unemployment situation currently, and then maybe kind of wrap up with the kind of Biden scorecard that you pulled together, and how we want to think about scoring the administration from a business perspective.
Okay. I think unemployment, the good news is that as you look back to when the pandemic hit, the darker blue shows our unemployment, and then we've added on shadow unemployment at the top. The trend is our friend in this perspective. So I think that our unemployment areas, they're moving ever downward. And so let's just hope, Greg, that continues as we reach the right balance between workers coming back to work and meeting those needs as our economy opens up to the pandemic. I know the Kenan Institute has done some great work in their 7 Forces paper, talking with CEOs about this and on what the opportunities are. So I think that this return to employment is going to be interesting, and hopefully we will find jobs and workers to meet those needs in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right now is a very interesting situation, because there has been this really rapid shift in terms of what demand for labor types are. And so, we are already seeing a lot of anecdotal reports of businesses saying they're having a hard time hiring people with certain skill sets, just because of the way things match up in the economy. What's needed right now is different than what's being supplied, even among the existing unemployed. But then there's this whole separate group of folks that have been sidelined, and then what happens as they come back or don't come back to the market is, I think, going to be important for how businesses manage the expansion over the next 6 to 12 months. So let's wrap up here. You've pulled together a scorecard for us. Kind of walk us through how Biden's doing so far, and how we should think about where things might be going over the next few months.
Well, certainly from the scorecard, we've had the negative impact of COVID on our employment situation, but you can certainly see the positive factors of the positive stock market reactions, and consumer confidence is trending upward. And President Biden has been pretty steady in his approval versus disapproval ratings moving forward. His issues and policies have been polling pretty well generically, but there is not a lot of detail on it. But I think that with this positive economic stimulus coming in, President Biden is very aware that this will be important going into the 2022 elections. So I think that that's something to really watch for as we move forward.
Great. All right, so let's turn to a few questions now. So we had a question come in about China and Taiwan in particular. And you mentioned this. I mean, there's clearly a long history there, but maybe an emboldened China in the current situation, more willing to be aggressive there. I mean, do you think there really is a possibility in the short term of China taking military or other severe actions towards Taiwan in a way that would be disruptive? To the broader
That's
economy?
yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I think that businesses should think very closely about Taiwan, because in some of the confirmation hearings, as we heard from our various defense conferees, they touched directly on Taiwan and said that they could expect a China takeover of Taiwan as soon as 6 to 9 years, if not sooner. And certainly the China in that Anchorage, Alaska meeting was speaking much more boldly about Taiwan and treating China and Taiwan as one China, very much so.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, some of the things people have been talking about lately in terms of supply chain disruptions in the semiconductor business. I mean, Taiwan is a huge part of those issues. So we've also seen over the last year or two increasing political positioning by corporations stepping into conversations they might have avoided in previous years. And I think in particular, one that's been in the news lately is the fact that Biden called on Major League Baseball to move the All-Star game from Georgia. So where are the political winds blowing here? Are we going to see continued interaction between the business sector and political issues where business leaders feel compelled to step into these because of either their own kind of ethics or because they're being demanded by employees or customers or other stakeholders? It's just an interesting time to kind of look at that interface between politicians and business people.
Well, when I've advised the C-suite on dealing with these issues, which have become between the events of last summer and social media, you really have to find that right balance, particularly with the BRT's announcements. I think you're going to see much more awareness of a stakeholder fiduciary duty, if you will, beyond shareholders, and that conversation is going to continue. I do think that as you get beyond opining on things that directly deal with your corporations, you have to weigh that balance between you're going to have a variety of interest amongst your employees, amongst your shareholders. So if you are going to opine on something, I think you've got to think about what are the long-term relationships? Is this a critical issue? Are you providing your employees and leading in the community as you would like? And so that I do think that conversation needs to strike that right balance and awareness of leading. So will it continue? I think it will. I think the important thing about all of this is, can we have a conversation? I get distressed when people, certainly around the Georgia thing, if we cannot find a way to make sure that everybody has the right to vote and can exercise their voting right while protecting integrity in the system. We've got to come together as a nation and a country and meet both those objectives. And I think that smart and wise people can come together and do that. So I hope that those will be some of the lessons learned for business and for our communities at large, is to come together and have a beneficial conversation.
Yeah. I mean, these are issues that I think increasingly businesses are expected to opine on, these are probably very difficult waters to navigate for a lot of businesses that prefer to do things quietly, or let those be political issues they didn't have to deal with at all. So we got time for maybe one more question here. Question about the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus. So tell us briefly, for those of us that aren't familiar with that, what is the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus, and how could it influence policy and legislation going forward?
Well, this is one of the brightest spots, I think, in Congress today, is the Problem Solvers Caucus. And we saw them in action and probably weren't even aware of it. They were they're composed of 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats in the Senate, and about 40 Republicans and Democrats in the House. And they work together, bridging that party lines. And we saw that first happen at the end of last year, when it was the Republicans and Democrats in the Senate that pushed forward to get a pandemic relief bill enacted. And they did so on a bipartisan basis. So I'm very excited about this group, and certainly hope that we will see more of them, because you'll find that any legislation that is gone through on a bipartisan basis tends to be more long lasting and not just whipsawed from one party to another, depending on who's in charge.
Yeah, no, that's great. It is encouraging, and I think we need that as a country to have conversations that are kind of respectful conversations on important issues, and limit the yelling and short-termism that seems to have dominated some of the political discourse over the last, even certainly predating the Trump administration. So I think we probably need to wrap it up there. Any closing remarks from you, Mary Moore? We certainly are so glad that you were able to spend time with us today and unpack these first 100 days.
Well, it's truly a pleasure. I enjoy anytime I have an opportunity to advise business and boards, and I encourage everybody to continue the conversation. I think we've got my contact information on LinkedIn, and I look forward to this and having future conversations with you, Greg, on Kenan Insights as we move forward.
Yeah, no, it's great. And certainly what the Kenan Institute is, a big part of our mission is trying to understand how we can take the knowledge that comes from research and work that we do here and make it relevant to business people and to policymakers. And this is a great example of that, trying to understand exactly how these different groups can inform the work that we're all trying to do. So thank you so much for taking the time. And certainly I hope if those in the audience have questions for Mary Moore, you'll reach out directly to her. Feel free to email me as well, and I can connect you if need be. Thanks again. I hope everyone has a great rest of your week.